Listen, imagine a lantern swinging over a buried mouth, a lamp held above the slow, deliberate dirt of a secret. The first 10 seconds of this tale is that lamp swinging, revealing only a narrow pool of truth while the rest remains black. In March of 1913, the Charleston Gazette printed a small paragraph that might as well have been a blameless obituary for silence. A woman named Margaret Hensley had left Smoky Hollow after a quarrel with her husband, Caleb. The line was polite, practical, and final. But what the paper could not capture was the way the hollow held its breath, the way the land itself tightened like a fist around something it wanted to hide. Listen closely now, and if the sound of this unburied sentence catches you, type "The veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Tell me where you are listening from and what hour this voice finds you. Subscribe if you want these buried names to be pulled into daylight. Smoky Hollow was not a place that invited witnesses. It lay in folded ridges where fog swallowed the edges of houses and neighbors learned to keep to themselves. Families in the hollow built walls with silence as much as with timber. The Hensleys had a modest farm, rocky fields, and a house whose roof held smoke like a sigh. Caleb, once a miner, walked with the memory of the pit in his step, a limp and a temper shaped by darkness. Margaret had been a teacher from Greenbrier County. Books, hymns, and open kindness were her origin. She married Caleb in 1906, and the valley swallowed her light. She sang no more in church. She stopped attending altogether. By 1910, she was seen at a distance, a ghost at the window. Sometimes at the well, sometimes tending the children, but never meeting another's eye. Neighbors would later recall the slow shrinking of her presence, as though it were weather, but weather that eats at the bone. Caleb began to dig in the long nights behind the house. Lantern light flitted like a secret in the dark. A trench appeared that would not read as a garden to those who watched deeper, timbered inside, iron, hind as if to hold more than potatoes. What followed was a slow pact between fear and indifference that would cost a life. After the Gazette's small shrug, the hollow held its breath like a waiting lung. Sheriff Jonas Wilkes came once and left a report that read, "Tidy on paper, clothes missing, house in order, no sign of struggle." He filed it away and life, at least officially, resumed. Yet Wilkes kept a private note, later found in a battered notebook, a narrow trench behind the house, earth tamped in a way that did not match a garden, timbers set like a shaft, a door hung with iron. He wrote too of children's eyes that darted toward Caleb before they answered, of a boy who started to say his mother's name and stopped when his father cleared his throat. That private unease never became law, but unease is patient. Eleanor Grant, Margaret's sister, refused the paper's convenient ending. Letters from her sister had thinned into caution and then into silence. Eleanor rode across ridges to demand the truth and stood at the Hensley gate while Caleb's body filled the doorway like a verdict. "She left," he said. The sheriff nodded, closed his notebook, and promised nothing. Eleanor returned home with anger folded into her chest like a pressed shirt. She sent parcels to the children and received only Caleb's careful replies. When she pressed for visits, he refused, saying her presence unsettled the household. People who worked for the family were given rules carved in a hush: do not touch the cellar, do not pry, mind the child's needs. Martha Jenkins, who came to help with cleaning, felt the authority of those rules in the squeeze of her spine. She saw Clara startle when a hand gripped too hard. Samuel flinched at sudden sounds, as if the house still gave voice to effort. Neighbors whispered. Children dared one another to creep close to the fence and came back thin-faced, eyes hollow with questions no adult would ask aloud. Men at the store over cups of coffee said the place carried a weight. Time did not erase the weight. It settled deeper, like silt in the riverbed, until the memory of Margaret's absence became a presence in itself, one that would not rest until it was faced. A midwife left uneasy, noting the house felt cold and Margaret's eyes were distant. Neighbors would later recall these as the first signs. Each small note collected like a pebble. Together they would become an avalanche one day. Rumor moves like smoke through a valley. It curls into corners, it stains conversations, and it follows the youngest, who will carry it as truth without the adults' explanations. Children at school called the Hensley home the digging house, and their dares became a kind of liturgy to creep to the fence and listen for a soft, regular tapping, for a sound like a shovel cutting earth at night. Helen Barker, their teacher, kept notes in a diary that would later read like breadcrumbs drawings of a woman beneath soil, the words "Mama sleeping" in a child's scrawl, a boy who looked past lessons as if staring through a wall. These are the small clues that historians would call circumstantial. To the hollow, they were proof enough to quiet a small part of the conscience. Time gave the story texture. Caleb's withdrawal from town increased, his repairs to the cellar became more frantic, and his steps at night matched the scrape of those who worked before dawn. Yet the law did not taste the metal tang of suspicion until decades later. For now, those who dared speak did so under the cover of generalities. At the store in Fagotville, men spoke of a house that made their skin prickle. Women sent each other notes to avoid the Hensley place. They called it unclean in the way of a household made dangerous by secret grief. And still, in the marrow of the hollow, closure was not reached. If you are hearing this and feel the same slow anger I do, if you want these names pulled from the earth, leave a note below telling me where you listen from and subscribe to follow as we untangle what was hidden for decades. The Hensleys' quiet life gave way to action in 1918 when Caleb sold the farm with a haste that looked like flight. Harper's crew pried into the block space and found objects that felt like proof: a leather comb with hair, scraps of patterned cloth, a jar's broken lip. To Harper it was debris. To those who remembered, it was an accusation. Neighbors murmured that the ground itself seemed eager to confess. Harper kept the finds in a box until he could not ignore the house's cold reputation and moved away. Decades collected themselves across the Hensley land like rings in a tree, each year marking another layer of neglect. The house passed through hands that stayed only long enough to sleep and leave. Some blamed the soil, some blamed bad weather. Teenagers dared one another to stand at the threshold and return with tales of a lantern failing to light or a chill that crawled into bones. The hollow made a myth of the place, a mother buried beneath her own kitchen, a lamp that swung without wind. These stories hardened into custom. They were told at suppers and at wakes until the line between fear and history blurred. Owners learned the house's rhythms and left offerings of distance: avoid the back room, never pry at the cellar, sleep with the light. Then in 1954, an ordinary couple from Charleston bought the property as if buying a tidy plot of acreage for hunting. Walter and Ruth Simmons came to the hollow without history in their pockets. They saw only weeds, repairs that could be made, and land cheap enough to be worth the work. Ruth began the kind of hands-on exploration that happens when someone believes a house can be saved. She pried away rotten boards and felt something under her fingernail, a leather-bound book swollen with damp. When she peeled the pages apart, the ordinary became accusation. Margaret's handwriting, the gentle domestic entries, spiraled into frantic scrawl. It was a revelation that split the valley's long consent in two. The diary spoke in quiet sentences and then in halting, frightened bursts. It spoke of a tonic given nightly, of Caleb's orders that windows and doors be sealed, of the way the cellar was called a sanctuary that made Margaret tremble. When Ruth read the line dated February 17, 1913, he has found these words. His rage is terrible. The children are locked in their room. She stopped as if the air had weight. She took the diary to Walter and then to the sheriff. In the comments below, if this cracks something open in you, type "the veil is broken" twice and witness how a single voice can unravel generations of silence. The sheriff, armed with words written by the dead, ordered the sealed cellar opened. The hollow watched as law pried 4 decades careful silence into light. People spoke then of responsibility and shame loudly. When shovels met the reclaimed cellar, the valley held a different breath, one of anticipation and a peculiar grief. Deputies cleared rotted beams and left iron hinges to creak as men probed the compacted soil. The first thing the spade struck was cloth, not bone, a faded dress like a page from a life folded under the weight of earth. They worked with method rather than melodrama, because that is how law must translate old fears into facts. Beneath the cloth came the bones, curled as if in sleep, arms arranged in a manner that suggested constraint. The skull bore a fracture along its left side consistent with a severe blow. Around the wrists the remains held traces of wire. The medical examiner's words were efficient and quiet: blunt force trauma, evidence of binding, and chemical residues indicating exposure to early sedatives. The diary's letters matched the laboratory's readout. Margaret's final pages spoke of a tonic that made her weak, of a rage in a man who policed the house with a watchman's obsession. When the coroner read his notes aloud, the hollow heard more than a verdict. It heard the names of actions that had been whispered for years. Justice, when it arrives late, arrives with cumulative certainty. In the court of public memory, however, judgment takes other forms: the slow folding of grief into stories, the naming of culpability in the way people avoid a family name at dinner. If this finding moves you, please subscribe and write below where you are listening from. Such small acts turn silence into company and give this voice reach beyond the hollow. Legal action could not reach Caleb. He had died 20 years earlier in a hospital, buried under a stone that could not answer for his hands. The children, traced by records and relatives, led separate lives. Samuel left to work and was later killed in war. Clara lived long enough to tell whatever a lifetime of obedience would allow. She would later be found in Ohio and questioned about what she remembered, her answers cautious, shaped by decades of fear and habit. The excavation did not close a wound so much as it exposed its edges and demanded the region names the thing that had been done. The hollow shifted then, as if learning to carry the weight of truth alongside its old habits. It would remember differently. The coroner's report became the skeleton key that opened conversations that had been kept behind locked doors. Reporters arrived to ask old questions and to write new ones. Historians later would sift through headlines and find a pattern of omission in the way newspapers had once treated a wife's disappearance as a private matter. The sheriff's notebook, exposed by the inquiry, read like a man's conscience caught mid-turn. Hensley seemed composed. Children watched him before answering. Fresh earth behind the house. No body, no case. It was the kind of line that reveals how institutional habit lets a narrative remain unchallenged. Caleb himself had been shaped by systems, a miner's culture that prized silence, a community where a man's privacy was rarely violated, and a legal apparatus unwilling to pry without a corpse. Now there was a corpse, and still justice encountered a limit. Caleb had died in 1935, moved through a brief confinement in a state hospital, and then to pneumonia in a town far from the hollow. He could not be tried. Time had already done its final work. The children, however, would carry the case from paper into life. Samuel's path away from the valley closed with his wartime death. Clara's life was a study in how trauma shapes obedience. When investigators finally spoke with Clara decades later, she answered like someone translating a private vocabulary into the language of official fact. She spoke of nights when the house felt narrow, of tastes in her mouth from a syrup she could not name, of the sound of her father's shovel. But Clara's words were limited by years of learned silence. She had been taught to measure truth carefully, to fold it into small, manageable pieces. The community, meanwhile, had to reconcile the way it had protected its own habits at the cost of a woman. Some apologized quietly. Others defended their earlier inaction as prudence. Newspapers asked how such a thing could be missed. The answer was as crude as it was painful. The machinery of daily life often overshadows the machinery of justice. People tend to believe the simplest story. They prefer tidy explanations that keep their routines intact. And so a lesson was unearthed. The institutions, like individuals, can be complicit in silence, and silence itself becomes a system that requires its own unweaving. Communities, when faced with truth, sometimes choose reform, sometimes they only remember. Margaret's diary, once private and damp, became the mouthpiece of a woman whose ordinary sentences turned into desperate records. She wrote of a tonic Caleb brewed each evening, of how it dulled her mind and made her hands tremble. In those pages she kept a small, stubborn intelligence, the way she hid words in the hems of letters, the way she slipped a line about the children's names into an otherwise ordinary shopping list. Read in sequence. The diary reveals a method of control that is almost clinical. First isolation, then a narrowing of routine, then the imposition of a chemical sleep that dulls resistance. In that layout, one sees the architecture of domination, the same scaffolding found in institutions that would later impose quiet on those beneath them. This is not merely a mountain tale, It is a pattern that repeats where power meets vulnerability. If this aspect of the story reaches you, subscribe and write where you are listening from. When we gather names from different places, we build a map that refuses the old ease of ignoring the hurt in our own vicinity. The diary contains more than a list of abuses. It sketches a mind learning to resist. Margaret describes small acts that slipped past, angers pouring the tonic onto the garden soil when she could, hiding a scrap of her own handwriting behind a loose board, singing under her breath in the pantry so the children might retain a melody of normalcy. There is a haunting tenderness in these tactics. They are survival, they are the secret prayers of someone tenderly making a way toward witness. Yet the diary also records fear of a man's surveillance, of corners watched, of a rage that does not sleep. Over time the pages become jagged, lines slanted as if written with a hand that could no longer steady itself. The final entries read like a woman keeping a small fire alive against a rising storm. She hopes letters will be found, hopes a sister will come, hopes that a loss stronger than habit will answer her distress. That hope would be realized only decades later, when a different set of hands peeled the pages apart, and the hollow had to face what it had allowed to be hidden. It forces a look at the quiet networks that enable such cruelty, and the rituals that normalize silence today. The excavation's images, men bent over a hole, earth spilled like a confession, entered small papers and private memory both. Photographs would show the dress, the bone, the wire curled about wrist bones. Readers decades away would react with a macabre clarity that the original witnesses had not allowed themselves. To live inside a system that values privacy more than a woman's safety is to make silence structural. The hollow had, for generations, been built on a set of unspoken rules: do not pry, do not gossip, honor a man's space. Those rules are not neutral. They are an architecture of power that shelters violence when it is convenient. In another register, the story reads like an allegory of ancient corruption, communities and institutions that preen their moral virtue while grafting quiet corners for cruelty. There is an ugly logic to such arrangements. If you are moved by what you hear, type "the veil is broken" twice in the comments to bind this truth to your name and feel how one ritual can crack a shared denial. The medical report sealed what the diary suggested: traces of sedatives in preserved tissue, a depressed fracture to the skull, bindings consistent with wire. Margaret's death was not a misfortune, but a choice enacted by another's hand. The dead tell their stories reluctantly, but when the dead speak in both paper and lab result, the combined force is difficult to dismiss. What followed was not only forensic work but a communal accounting: who had allowed a man to dictate the boundaries of a home unchallenged, who had preferred conjecture over inquiry. The county convened questions, journalists asked them aloud. Families who had turned their heads learned that turning is an action with consequences. Yet even as facts emerged, the deeper systems of quiet did not dissolve overnight. The hollow's social habits persisted in other forms: a refusal to look directly at the cost of convenience, a half apology muttered over fences, and a slow, complicated effort to teach children that asking is sometimes the beginning of protection rather than trespass. Clara, asked decades later, moved through memories like someone walking through a house burned years before. She kept much to herself, revealing only shards that fit a lifetime of constrained speech. The hollow's elders debated reforms, but real change requires naming and insisting. Tiny actions multiplied until policy and habit begin to bend, and neighbors listening. When investigators reached Clara in Ohio, she had already turned her life into a ledger of unspoken decisions. She gave answers wrapped in the caution of someone who had been taught that certain truths brought danger rather than relief. Yet under patient questioning, she unlocked fragments: a syrup that tasted of bitterness, a lantern swinging behind the house like a pendulum, a father's hand that corrected too hard. Those fragments stitched into the medical findings and the diary to form a narrative, no longer dismissible as rumor. Samuel's path away from the hollow rid like a thread pulled from a cloth: an enlistment, work in warehouses, and a fate a foreign shore where his name was carved on a memorial. He never had a chance to rewrite his childhood into testimony. Clara's testimony, fragile and careful, nevertheless helped the hollow to reinterpret its earlier tolerance. People began to ask questions about how communities defend themselves against facing injustice. Some blamed simple ignorance, others could not rid themselves of the suspicion that habit had been the real accomplice. The Hensley farm, once emptied of its owners, lingered as a lesson. It taught a generation to notice the signals they had previously dismissed: persistent digging at odd hours, the way a man might insist on sealing doors, the choice to accept a single story instead of looking for others. Over time, the farm's ruin became a public archive. Wood-rotted gutters sagged, and yet the ground kept artifacts like a stubborn witness. The house's decay did not expunge memory, it preserved it in objects and in the slow age of those who had been near it. By the 1950s, the story had passed from rumor to recorded history, and with documentation came calls for ethical thinking about how to prevent a recurrence. Scholars would later note the Hensley case as a caution: when a culture privileges privacy over accountability, it creates incubators for cruelty. Psychologists mapped a stare of control: isolation, economic restrictions, chemical dulling, and ritualized instruction, all present here in human scale. The Hollow's silence had been a mechanism, not merely an absence. The community, waking decades later, began small reforms: more reporting, neighborly insistence, laws nudged into place. With narrative now anchored by documents and bones, the Hollow's conversation turned to accountability. Editorials asked the hard questions: how had such a steady disappearance been dismissed as personal choice? How could institutions be blind to patterns spelled out in diary and ledger? These were not merely rhetorical, they demanded repair. Historians later observed that when evidence piles high enough, it forces systems to adapt. Slowly, imperfectly, but inevitably. For those who had grown up in the Hollow, the changes were visceral. Some neighbors admitted that the community had favored privacy at the cost of a woman's safety. Others retreated into denial. In the middle of this uneasy reckoning, Clara's voice remained careful, sepia-toned like an old photograph. She allowed journalists to record a few memories but declined to become a spectacle. The Hollow, in conversation with itself, also began to see broader patterns: families that kept secrets, law enforcement that deferred to appearance, clergy who valued decorum over inquiry. Those patterns resonated beyond one valley. They showed how social systems can hide cruelty within ordinary practice. If you feel compelled to follow this unspooling of history, subscribe and tell me where you are listening from. Your location ties us together into a map of witness and compassion, a network resistant to repeating the old mistakes. Public memory nonetheless required ritual, and so a small memorial was arranged near the spot where the cellar had been reopened. It was simple: a stone with Margaret's name, a modest plaque that explained the discovery, and a few wildflowers placed by hands that remembered how to mourn. Such acts did not bring justice in the legal sense. They created a place for sorrow and a token that the valley would look at its own past rather than bury it again. The memorial became a locus for education. School groups were brought to learn about responsibility, and local meetings discussed how to spot patterns of coercion. Clara lived quietly, her days shaped by the knowledge of what had been hidden beneath hearth and laundry. She taught neighbors that asking questions is not impolite, it is protective. Over time, the Hollow adopted small policies: regular welfare checks, more transparent record-keeping, laws nudged into place forever. The Hensley case entered scholarly conversation in unexpected ways. Social scientists wrote papers about the dynamics of rural silence. Ethicists used the Hollow as a case study in the moral cost of non-intervention. Psychologists mapped the pattern of coercion that the diary and testimony illustrated. The story, once local, became a lens: how communities construct narratives that protect habits over people, how institutional inertia favors the neat record over the messy truth. These academic frames did not feel like immediate consolation to the people who had lived the events, but they mattered. They provided vocabulary and models that could be taught to future officials and neighbors. In classrooms, students learned to recognize the early symptoms of domestic replacement: routine isolation, sudden economic withdrawals, odd repairs performed in secret. Policy followed, inch by cautious inch: training for rural sheriffs, protocols for welfare checks, and campaigns to reduce the stigma of reporting suspected abuse. The Hensley narrative thus became both a memorial and a manual, a tragic primer on the way the ordinary can be weaponized. At heart, this tale is about power in its smallest domestic forms. A husband policing his wife's presence, a community that cushions itself against the responsibility of asking, a justice system that will not move without visible evidence. These patterns repeat in other times and places. We call them different names, but they are kin. Recognizing a pattern is not an abstraction, it is a survival tool. Change, when it arrives, is rarely dramatic. It arrives in repeated increments. A new training pamphlet here, a welfare visit there, the slow lowering of the threshold that allows intervention. Yet these small changes, multiplied across many communities, bend the arc of habit toward protection. Over the decades, the shadowed edges of Smoky Hollow began to soften under the pressure of vigilance and memory. This is why stories like this matter beyond horror. They teach communities to reframe privacy as responsibility. They show how rituals of concealment, habitual ignoring, polite deference, bureaucratic minimalism accrue into protection for violence. The act of telling is itself an antidote. Public naming, memorials, school lessons, and trained officials make possible a different future where small suspicions are treated as seeds worth investigating and thereby save others' future lives. Families carry the echoes of such events for generations. The trauma of Margaret's death and the children's enforced silence rippled outward. Nieces and nephews learned to avoid certain topics. Descendants carried questions they could not answer. Psychologists who studied families in the Hollow decades later described a pattern of inherited reticence. People learned to swallow curiosity because asking had once brought danger. This intergenerational hush is one of the loneliest outcomes of domestic violence. It teaches restraint as survival, and that restraint calcifies into a cultural reflex. Yet there were countercurrents. Teachers like Helen Barker, who kept diaries and remembered drawings, persisted in naming and in small acts of curiosity that seeded change. Martha Jenkins, who had felt Clara flinch and was told not to go near the cellar, spoke up when she could. Her testimony decades later helped connect memory to proof. The Hensley story, then, relies on the labor of people who refuse to reduce memory to comfort. That labor is quiet but fierce, as writing letters, keeping diaries, asking stubborn questions. Over time, these acts accumulated into a narrative the Hollow could no longer comfortably dismiss. This accumulation is a form of resistance against institutional forgetting. It becomes a method: gather evidence, preserve it, and insist until systems have to respond. On a human level, the case also revealed ordinary tenderness. Margaret, by many accounts, had been patient and small in the ways that make a life. The diary's domestic notes showed a woman who tended her children, soothed their clothes, and kept hymns in her throat when fear tightened the house. That tenderness makes the cruelty harder to bear because we see its soft edges. The contrast sharpens the moral failure of those who looked away. There is a kind of moral arithmetic in this. Each act of looking, each refused question, adds to an account that must be balanced. When we add remembrance to the ledger, we move toward balance. For modern listeners, the Hensley story is not only an old tragedy but an instruction. We must notice patterns our neighbors dismiss as private. We must support whistleblowers and train officials to read the subtle signs of coercion. Doing so is also a ritual: small, repeated ethical acts that accumulate like stones until they form a barrier against another quiet cruelty. The Hensley tale operates on three registers at once: the human, the institutional, and the archetypal. On the human level, we see a woman and her children, tender and constrained. On the institutional level, we see the sheriff's notebook, the bank withdrawals, and the decades-long neglect. On the archetypal level, we see an echo of forbidden history, a valley that hides what it does not wish to reckon with, a community that builds temples of privacy where blame can shelter. That trio is where ancient corruption meets modern inertia. When institutions refuse to act on soft evidence, they collaborate with cruelty. That realization should not leave us paralyzed. It should compel a practice of attention. If this story encourages you to stay and witness, subscribe and tell me where you are listening from. Your location becomes a point on a constellation of people who refuse the old comfort of looking away. The Hensley case is both particular and exemplary. Particular in its characters and details, the diary pages with their fragile script, the timbers that framed a cellar like a coffin, the bank ledgers noting withdrawals before winter. exemplary in how it demonstrates a mechanism of control that repeats in disparate settings, the slow erosion of agency through isolation, chemical dulling, and surveillance. Understanding mechanisms matters because naming a structure allows interventions policies for routine welfare checks, community education about coercive signs, and legal tools that lower the threshold for investigation when patterns appear. Without such measures, the pattern repeats, but names alone do not rescue the living. They must be accompanied by rituals of repair, memorials, education, formal apologies, and practical measures that support survivors and their descendants. These are the acts that transform a cautionary tale into a living commitment to prevent recurrence. Ancient corruption is not only the domain of kings and courts, it lives in household routines that prioritize reputation over safety. Psychological control systems are small mechanical things. A withheld word, a medication slipped at night, a child's obedience enforced with a look. But they scale when neighbors, clerics, and officials accept appearances. Solidarity breaks that scaling neighbors who report, teachers who ask questions, relatives who refuse to normalize fear. If a quiet story unsettles you, speak it aloud, write it down, and share it with someone who can act. Memory is an abrasive thing. It polishes what we thought immutable and reveals the outlines of what we refuse to name. The Hensley case shows how a single discovery can corrode complacency and open up reasoning about responsibility. Memorials and plaques are not mere tokens. They are public declarations that say this place will not forget. They demand that children learn differently and that officials measure odd absences with more rigor. Yet institutional change must be matched with private practice. Families must teach curiosity rather than discourage it. Neighbors must rehearse the habit of intervention rather than the habit of minding their own business. In a quieter register, the case also pushed people to ask philosophical questions about silence itself. Is silence a virtue when it is chosen and a weapon when it is enforced? That question has ancient roots, and answering it requires moral reflection as much as policy updates. Smoky Hollow became a site where such reflection was practiced. Small groups read the diary aloud and discussed what they would have done. Schools used the case as a caution and a template, teaching children how to recognize manipulative patterns in ways adults had not learned. The ripple of these practices across a community is hard to quantify, but hard to deny. Fewer unexamined absences, more reports, more neighbors who knew the look of a child who flinched under pressure. The work is tedious. It is not heroic in the popular sense. It is, instead, the patient tending of a moral garden. Over time, the Hollow's rituals changed. The instinct to assume privacy restored as default gave way to a default of shared responsibility. That shift does not mean the valley became a place without darkness. It means the darkness could no longer hide as easily behind manners and reputation. Communities that learn to add small acts of checking in to codify those acts into routine reduce the chances that silence will become active harm. The Hensley Memorial became more than stone. It became a set of practices, a school lesson each year, a neighbor call list, and a parish that asked about absences once tolerated for safety. As a listener, you are part of this unfolding. Stories are not inert, they require custodians. If you want to join a community that says we will not let silence shelter violence, subscribe and tell me where you are listening from. Your location marks a commitment, a witness outside the hollow who will not let the pattern repeat in fresh soil. The Hensley narrative asks us to retrain simple reflexes. We must move from polite deference to responsible curiosity. A neighbor who asks why a woman is not seen in public, a teacher who records strange drawings, a shopkeeper who notes his customers' absences. These are not invasive acts, they are the stitches that keep a social fabric whole. Consider how Margaret hid words in seams and how those seams later became the threads by which she could be found. Small acts of attention accumulate. On a psychological level, the case teaches about control's slow arithmetic. Coercion is built from tiny choices repeated over time. Undoing such control requires equally patient exercises of attention. It is less dramatic than a rescue in fiction. It is more faithful to the way real safety is made. Practically, this means cultivating habits, checking in when someone seems absent, offering to help with errands, asking direct questions in private, and writing down any patterns that repeat. It means refusing to treat privacy as absolute in situations where power is uneven. That refusal is an ethical stance one can adopt immediately. The Hensley story is also an invitation to change the way we talk about past wrongs. We can speak of Margaret not as a haunting, but as a person whose name requires stewardship. We can name the institutions that failed her and insist on training, on transparency, and on a culture where questions are an act of care rather than intrusion. Start today. Check your neighbors by name. Normalize asking, is everything all right? In your community groups, support shelters, and press local officials for welfare checks when patterns of disappearance or withdrawal appear. Teach children that asking is protection, not betrayal. Host listening circles where diaries like Margaret's are read aloud and discussed. Small civic rituals, memorial walks, school lessons, community watch lists. Translate grief into protection. Take responsibility now, and your small actions will ripple outward over years, starting today, starting here. The pattern that allowed Margaret's fate is not unique. It is a vector in systems where power and privacy intersect. When I say hidden agendas, I do not mean conspiracies in the sensational sense. I mean the quotidian arrangements that protect reputations and thereby allow harm to continue. Companies, churches, and small communities all can hold practices that prioritize order over safety. The Hensley case is a microcosm of such arrangements. A man with a history of working in the mines carrying forward a cultural habit of silence, a sheriff who deferred to appearances, neighbors who equated prying with immorality. Those are institutional choices with human faces. Once we look for them, we see similar vectors elsewhere. A supervisor who tolerates a man's erratic control at home because he is useful at work, a landlord who refuses to ask about a tenant's repeated absences for fear of paperwork, a community that upholds privacy as a sacrosanct norm. These choices have direction, they funnel consequence toward the vulnerable. Understanding this helps us design interventions. We can craft policies that force appearances to be tested rather than merely accepted. We can require that sudden withdrawals from social life trigger welfare checks, that teachers' diaries be given weight in municipal decisions, that banks flag unusual patterns of withdrawals linked to domestic isolation. These are mundane technical changes, but they can frustrate the architecture of silence. There is also a cultural task. We must reframe questions as acts of care. That reframing challenges old notions of propriety. It asks a community to prefer being uncomfortable in the short term to ignoring harm in the long term. The Hensley story sits at the intersection of private wrongdoing and public failure. It teaches us how small acts repeated make environments safe or dangerous. We can choose which we will build. Practical steps include mandatory reporting training tied to rural sheriff budgets, community liaisons who track elder and family welfare, school modules teaching children to name discomfort, and local health clinics screening for signs of coercion. These strategies are not radical. They are administrative choices that redirect default behavior away from complacency and thus protect vulnerable lives. Survivors often carry contradictory burdens. They must grieve what was taken and also learn to survive within systems that once failed them. Clara's life, when finally examined, was not a neat tale of victimhood but a complex navigation of loyalty, fear, and self-preservation. She maintained ties to the hollow while living under its long shadow, balancing her need for safety against the small acts of testimony she could offer. That ambivalence is common. People who endure coercion must often negotiate relationships with those who were complicit or who are themselves caught in the culture of silence. Understanding that complexity is essential to building compassionate responses. The Hensley story also shows the delicate work of restoring dignity to lives erased by secrecy. Memorials and plaques matter because they act as public apologies. They publicly acknowledge a wrong and refuse the convenience of silence. But restoration requires more than monuments. It requires investment in survivors' counseling, financial support, and social services that help rebuild routines and trust. It requires communities to adopt practices that validate testimony rather than punish it. Where such practices exist, people recover agency. Where they don't, trauma calcifies and passes through generations. There is an ethical question sitting in the center of this case. How do we weigh a person's privacy against the duty to protect? A stark answer is painful but clear. When power is imbalanced, privacy must be balanced by care. That care can be administered in many forms: a welfare check, a neighborly visit, a school intervention, small acts that ground suspicion until it becomes actionable. The broader lesson is that institutions and neighbors alike have moral work to do to create defaults that err on the side of protection rather than comfort. You can help volunteer at shelters, donate to survivor funds, support non-profit legal clinics that help bring evidence forward, and press elected officials to fund rural social services. Encourage schools to include curricula on coercive control, and lobby for bank policies that flag suspicious withdrawals. These are concrete ways listeners outside Smoky Hollow can take the lesson beyond narrative into prevention. Small acts in many places stitch a safety net where one did not exist. Smoky Hollow did not flip a switch and become perfect overnight. Change is an accretion of small actions and stubborn habits. Yet the discovery of Margaret and the diary created pressure that the valley could not fully resist. Local meetings debated welfare protocols, school curricula adjusted to include exercises in noticing, the sheriff's office changed record-keeping. Organizations in nearby towns used the case as a teaching moment in training sessions. These were not large victories, but they were structural. They changed default behavior and made neglect more costly. If you are hearing this and want to take part in the web of witnesses that prevents another silence, subscribe and tell me where you are listening from. Your geography matters. It helps build a map of attention that refuses to leave gaps where harm can be hidden. There is a psychological consequence to this work as well, the transformation of identity. When communities adopt a stance of active noticing, individuals learn to see themselves as caretakers rather than passive observers. That shift is profound. It changes how people move through neighborhoods, how they speak to friends, and how they interpret absence. The Hollow's rituals evolved into practices of soft surveillance, not the invasive kind that violates dignity, but practices that prioritize safety through attentive presence. Over decades, the community rehearsed these practices until they became norm, checking in when someone missed a public event, asking neighbors if they needed help, refusing to let a single voice dominate a household without scrutiny. There is a quiet heroism in these modest acts. They are the unromantic labor of prevention. Consider how this reorientation operates in practice. Neighbors form rotating check in rosters so no absence goes unattended. Teachers are empowered to contact social services when a child shows signs of enforced withdrawal. Towns publish anonymous reporting lines. Faith leaders are trained to listen without protecting abusers. Banks flag unusual cash withdrawals linked to dependency. Each technical fix rewrites a default. Over time, people internalize these new defaults and their identities shift toward active care. If you carry this story outward, you are part of a contagious ethic. The Hollow is not a relic. It is a template for vigilance. Keep this memory alive as instruction and as warning. Margaret Hensley's story belongs to a larger lineage of forbidden histories, accounts of people whose names were erased by custom, by negligence, or by deliberate harm. These are the histories that institutions prefer to forget because remembering requires admissions. Hidden agendas flourish where institutional reputation is prioritized over individual safety. This is especially true in small communities and in organizations that value order, but it is also true in large systems where PR and liability calculations replace moral imagination. The Hensley case is a clear, instructive example. The ledger entries, the diary, the coroner's report, taken together, reveal a pattern of concealment and social indifference. To speak of ancient corruption in this context is to note that societies long ago established hierarchies of value, deciding whose suffering merits intervention. The modern challenge is to dismantle those hierarchies where they persist and to institute practices that respect vulnerability. Part of that dismantling is pedagogical, teaching future officials, teachers, and neighbors to recognize the subtle signs of coercion and to act when patterns emerge. Another part is structural, designing public systems that reward inquiry rather than complacency. But moral education is also required. We must cultivate the habit of empathy that refuses to let another's routine be excused because it is inconvenient to intervene. The cost of inaction is not only a single life, it is the slow corrosion of communal integrity. When communities accept small injustices for the sake of calm, they erode the very thing that allows them to claim goodness. Concretely, change looks like clearer reporting obligations, better funded rural social services, training for clergy and community leaders, anonymous hotlines, and legal thresholds that allow investigation based on a pattern of circumstantial evidence rather than waiting for catastrophe. It looks like schooling that normalizes curiosity and friends who do not equate asking with betrayal. It looks like economic supports that reduce dependence and thereby reduce leverage abusers have. It looks like communities that place the safety of a neighbor above the comfort of silence. In such societies, a Margaret Hensley would be noticed in time, not found too late, and communities would heal. The ground finally gave up its secret, and the lamp that had swung above it for 40 years showed us what silence had cost. Now the lamp goes out in one place and burns in another, in classrooms, in sheriff's offices, in the hands of neighbors who will no longer look away. This is the practical aftermath, but there is also a private consequence, the remapping of identity. When you have learned to name a wrong, you are not the same person you were before that lesson. You become a custodian of memory. You are obliged to carry that name and to notice the small signs that a person might be in danger. That obligation is not dramatic. It is the daily commitment to ask questions when you could look away, to call on behalf of someone who seems reticent, to send a note that says simply, "Are you all right?" It is the refusal to let a culture prioritize comfort over compassion. The Hensley case teaches that such habits, when practiced long enough, become culture. They become protective. They alter the default. So end this story not with a sigh but with a vow. If this account moves you, take one small step today. Note one neighbor, send one message, sign up with a local community group, or support organizations that aid survivors. These acts are tiny but cumulative. They are the stitches that will hold the fabric of a community together when wind and weather test it. Remember Margaret Hensley as a person, not a ghost. Say her name aloud. Teach the next generation to ask rather than to assume. And let the Hollow's lesson ripple. Private silence can no longer be an excuse for public neglect. The past will always be there. History keeps the bones of the unspoken. But history does not have to be destiny. We can choose to be the people who answer when a lantern swings over a buried mouth. We can be the hands that lift the lamp and do not look away. That is our covenant, to multiply attention so that silence cannot conspire with power again. Keep this name with you, Margaret Hensley. Carry it like a key that opens doors others thought forever closed. Act not for ritual but for promise. Act once, act often, and teach your children to see when a neighbor's light grows dim today now.